Bruce, at what point does this cross the line from concerns about national security into racial profiling, discrimination, even racism?
Well, under rulings of the Supreme Court, it depends upon the motivation behind the particular proclamation. And it's similar in racial discrimination cases. And it crosses a line if a significant motivating factor can be demonstrated. Behind the order was to single out those who belong to Islam for adverse treatment. It doesn't mean it has to be everybody on the globe in order to be legally, constitutionally vulnerable. And if you could deduce from the numerous statements that you correctly said Mr. Trump used to describe what he was doing. He said it is a Muslim ban, not once, but repeatedly. And he's never retracted those statements, even after he's been elected president. Yeah. And when he had to revise the initial orders that were invalidated by the courts, he then scolded the Justice Department and said, well, you watered this down. I really didn't want to do this, but you forced me to because you had to give it a legal patina. So I think that it still remains vulnerable if additional information comes out after remand.
Yeah, in fact, there is a piece of tape that we have with President Trump talking. This was in December 2015. Let's watch.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Michael, isn't this what this is about?
That was a campaign statement.
Yeah.
It was not in any way associated with the issuance of the order, and nor was Donald Trump at that point president of the United States. So it reflected his personal view as a campaign statement.
Okay.
That statement evolved in tangible ways after he was in the Oval Office based on substantive information that was from him. And to his credit, he became much more flexible in the approach that he's taken to that based
let me get
on
Afshin's response to that. Did that view evolve, do you believe, after he became president?
Well, I think as the old adage goes, you know, where you stand depends on where you sit. And, you know, there was probably some complexities and some interest groups and others that came his way that persuaded him that you can't really do a full Muslim ban. But as I said earlier, it's not a Muslim ban, but it is the Muslim ban that President Donald Trump could get through, that could play to his base, et cetera. But there's a broader point here beyond this, whether this is a Muslim ban or not. This is collective punishment. This is collective targeting of individuals. To Negar's point, these are individuals who are being hurt there, and you know, the individuals who are actually in desperate moments. I mean, you look at what's happening in Yemen. You look at what's happening in Syria. Humanitarian crisis of devastating proportions. Iranians gallantly struggling for their freedom, going out onto the streets. President Donald Trump often in his speeches makes a distinction between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. Yeah. Well, now he's saying the Iranian people are just as complicit as the Iranian government in all of the crimes, you know, that they may have committed. So, you know, this is not something that George H.W. Bush would have done. This is not something that George W. Bush would have done. This is not something that Ronald Reagan would have done. Ronald Reagan always stood with individuals fighting for freedom in authoritarian and autocratic environments. And that's a key point that needs to be said
here. If I could just add also, Mr. Trump, after
Michael, I'll get you in a moment, Michael. Michael, I will get you in a moment.
After he was inaugurated, Michael referred to the tape, which was pre-inauguration, but after the inauguration, he repeated basically the same remarks. Right. And remember his first ban, which was invalidated, of course, specifically singled out Christians in those words. It wasn't disguised at all or sanitized. And then then he has to go back to the drawing board. Says, well, that doesn't pass muster. So he does it. Well, maybe I can recraft it in a new way. And I think it's important too that Mr. Trump has not retracted anything he said during his campaign as president, which he obviously could. He could have retracted it when he issued the executive order or otherwise.
Okay.
And I think it's clear that Mr. Trump, like politicians, is playing politics.
Michael, I will get to you in a moment, but Negar, I want to get your thoughts on the motivation behind this. I mean, is this about national security, or is it Trump playing politics? He's talking to his base here.
Well, we have to be fair that there is an issue with terrorism. There is an issue with radicalization. The concern that Michael talks about, that a big part of the President Trump's base talks about, that concern is genuine. It's not pure politics out of nowhere. But look at the recent terrorist attacks in the U.S. in California, the Boston bombing, going all the way back to 9/11. As it was mentioned, none of these countries that are in the travel ban, their citizens of these countries were part of these terrorist attacks. So when you put 1 + 1 or 2 + 2, how does this add up to national security? Is it just countries, like Afshin said, that don't have lobbying efforts and a political stand in Washington to basically stand for their citizens, and countries who have adversarial political also relations with the United States? Or is this really about national security? Is this going to stop the next California attack, the next Boston bombing, the next 9/11? Probably not, because it wouldn't have stopped it according to the citizens that we look at from those countries.
And on to Negar's point, you know, you talk to folks in Homeland Security, you talk to folks, you know, terrorism experts in the United States. Really, she's absolutely right. Terrorism is a threat here in the United States. But some of the most dangerous threats are actually homegrown terrorists, and the most significant attacks have been citizens or resident aliens, you know, not those who are coming from elsewhere. And so it is, you know, fundamentally, this issue also puts into question immigration. It's part of the immigration debate as well, and it fundamentally undermines this notion of how important immigration has been to America, to the American economy, to America's standing in the world.
Michael, we hear this acknowledgement, and you've heard it all round, that terrorism is a threat to this country. But isn't there a gaping hole in this argument that this is about terrorism when you leave out countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, like Egypt, which is where the 9/11 terrorists came from?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is not unprecedented. Firstly, Reagan and Carter both implemented similar restrictions with Cuba and with Iran, respectfully. Additionally, as it relates to 9/11, if we could go back retroactively and stop those individuals from entering this country on what actually, interestingly and importantly, were in many cases overstayed visas that were not enforced, would we do that to save 3,000 lives? I would hope that we would. But if we come out of that and have not learned the lesson that there are individuals abroad and that they happen in this current moment to be located in certain countries particularly, we are absolutely missing the lessons of 9/11, which cannot be forgotten. The president's first and foremost obligation is to the security of this country, not to foreigners' interest in coming here. In fact, on the immigration debate, if we opened this country to full immigration, anyone who wants to come would come, we would have 1 billion people here by most estimates. That's totally unrealistic. And those individuals in 9/11 who came here didn't advertise that they were going to be conducting terrorist activities. They came here to do flight training, to do other things that on the surface sounded perfectly legitimate, and of course were not.
Okay.
The disconnect, if I could interject here, between Michael said and what's really happened is that it's not true that the countries that are listed have been the source of the terrorist acts. That's the disconnect. Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Pakistan, Egypt have. And so when he says that's why they are listed, that's simply not why they are listed.
Right.
And that's why it looks to me like it's a political statement. It plays to his base. He doesn't really care whether it has any impact at all on terrorism. It just looks like he honored a campaign promise.
Yeah,
I also wanted to just add that
A lot of it has to do with the
even
vetting
if
processes.
those
I mean,
countries
Saudi
were
Arabia and
put-
Pakistan.
One moment, Michael. I'll come to you in a moment. Go
were
ahead.
put on the list, that doesn't make it okay to discriminate against all Saudis or all Pakistanis
Right.
or all Emiratis because 9/11 happened. But this is just going back to the intent
Right.
that if this is to stop terrorist attacks, this wouldn't have stopped any of the last major terrorist attacks in America. So this goes back to the intent. of
Right,
the
Bruce, to
president.
that point that both Afshin and Negar made, and that is that this is collective punishment. We are taking, even if we just take each country here, it is an entire country that is affected. Does the fact that it's collective punishment, does that pass constitutional muster?
Well, I don't think under the Constitution denying somebody a visa would be viewed as, quote, punishment in a criminal sense, detaining them. And so the government has much more leeway if you're just imposing general sanctions against, I mean, we have prohibitions upon visiting countries. You can't get a visa to visit certain countries, North Korea or whatever. So that raises it. I don't believe that if all the result is from having a broadband prohibition is an inability to get a visa, that would rise to the level of, quote, punishment, guilt by association, because that is something that's viewed in the criminal context. Here we're talking the civil context.
But haven't we got a situation here where you have not interviewed or talked to a single individual who might want to come to the United States, and you're saying, well, actually, you know, you can't come because there's this ban?
Well, we don't know, because there is, at least on the face of the order, there are waiver provisions. So you can come and say, I want a waiver for X, Y, Z particular reasons that relate to me alone. So that's the argument, that it isn't totally a blanket condemnation, because if you can make your case that you fit into these justifications and are cleared of any kind of suspicion of terrorism, you can technically come in, and there have been some waivers that have been granted. We don't have a long track record so far on that score.
Michael, what about Bruce's point that these countries that are affected by this ban, these countries are not the source of terrorists. They're not where terrorists are. They're not countries that threatened or have threatened the United States directly.
Yeah, it's one of the most compelling rebuttals. I think the response to it, which makes sense, is that there certainly are many individuals in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that wish the United States harm, but the relationship between the United States government and the governments in Islamabad and Riyadh have been sufficiently strong that we have a confidence in the vetting processes that they are implementing for those individuals who are visiting there. Yeah. We don't have that level of confidence in the countries that are included, and that's all the difference in the world.
Afshin, there is a perception in the United States, and we hear it very often from people here, leaders as well, that the United States treats American Muslims differently from other Americans. Is a ruling like this, and this is going not to the letter of the law, but possibly the spirit of the law, a ruling like this, does it reinforce that perception?
I think it reinforces that perception with people who already had that perception. It's not necessarily a perception that I share. I am worried about the rhetoric coming from the Oval Office, but I think American Muslims have the same legal rights, same constitutional rights that we all have. I think what the problem with this ruling is it tells an Iranian American colonel in the U.S. Marines that his grandmother, can't visit. It tells a Syrian American university professor who has been teaching legions and legions of students for years and years and contributing to American life that his sister is not welcome to attend his wedding. So for up until a couple of days ago, I would argue that would only reinforce the perception of those who held that perception. But now, since this Supreme Court ruling, I think among those people, they are justified in feeling that they are being targeted.
All right. Bruce, Afshin mentioned earlier on that there is a big immigration debate going on in this country right now, and what has happened in the Supreme Court is related to that, goes directly to that in many respects. Will that decision that was taken by the Supreme Court reshape that immigration debate?
I think that even though the decision itself says we don't approve the policy, the way it will play out in the debating arena politically is that it is a tacit approval, even though the court says we're just voting on its legality. And repeatedly, if you read the majority opinion, it says this may be an unwise policy, it may be disfavored by many, but we're just deciding the legal issue. So to that extent, I think it will work in favor of those who would want tighter immigration controls. I do want to say this as well with regard to the vetting process that Michael referred to. We have no idea what was and what has been investigated to determine whether or not countries had sufficient reliability in issuing passports, et cetera, to make the vetting process reliable. All we have is the statements of the advocates, and there was apparently a 17-page report that's supposed to be very skimpy, saying, well, we picked out these countries. So we don't have any real confidence because all of this is classified, that somehow Iraq or Iran has a less reliable vetting process in the information they provide to visa applicants than Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. It's just their say-so alone. And we know when it's secret and it never gets tested, the probability that is a lie is pretty high.
And I can tell you, it was never a breeze for people from those countries to get a visa in the first place. Yeah.
Right. Michael, looking at what this decision does to the image of America, which is a country of immigrants, if you look at the reputation of America, we had one dissenting opinion, one of two dissenting opinions in the U.S. Supreme Court. One was from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and she compared this actually to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. But directly on this case, this is what she had to say. She said, taking all the evidence together, a reasonable observer would conclude that the proclamation was driven primarily by anti-Muslim animus.
Yeah, I find the most amazing aspect of this decision the fact that 4 Supreme Court justices could come down on the other side of this. I mean, did they really carefully read the 1952 statute? They can disagree with the statute. That's perfectly their right, but that can't be a factor in their determination on the legality of applying the rule of law. If we're uncomfortable with the powers that are vested in the President of the United States on these issues, then Congress has to go back and revise that underlying law that guides all of it.
Okay, Michael.
And I don't think there's a basis to do that.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.